we've got two speakers tonight, and the first is going to be Vincent Gomez, who's a former investment banker. I don't think we've ever had an former investment banker speak at a Welsh Level Grassroots meeting before, but maybe we have. Anyway, he's now a member of 99%, which is, according to their blurb on their webpage, an inclusive volunteer movement looking to end mass impoverishment using peaceful means. So Vincent is going to speak to us for 20 minutes. We will then have our second speaker, and after that, it'll be open to the floor to ask questions or make points. So, Vincent, there you are. Are you happy to start now?
I'm ready. Let's go.
I'm going to get a clock just so I can make sure that that the time is going all right. Okay, I've got one. Okay, thank you. Yes.
Right, can everybody see that okay?
Yeah, I can.
Good. Okay. So I'll be as quick as I can with this. So it's going to be about 20 minutes. And what I'm really trying to achieve today is a quick overview of money creation in a modern fiat economy. So how is money created in a country like the UK that has full monetary sovereignty? What does it mean? And I'll touch on some points about debts and deficits and one or two other things, the Bank of England and commercial banking. I thought I'd start with a couple of quotes. I think really this misunderstanding of how money works in the UK kind of started around the Thatcher period with phrases such as these, there's no such thing as public money, there's only taxpayers' money, which in reality, when you actually understand money, you realize that it's actually 180 degrees different from that. There's no such thing as taxpayers' money, there is actually only public money. And then I thought this was a nice quote here from Goebbels. How did we get to this point? Well, you make the lie big, you make it simple, you keep saying it, and eventually the people will believe it. So quick outline of the presentation. First of all, I'm going to talk about the importance of monetary sovereignty. What does it mean for a country like the UK? Then we'll look at how money is created in a modern fiat economy, such as ours, how governments tax and spend, why do governments tax, are deficits good or bad? Indeed, what are government deficits? So starting with monetary sovereignty. So a monetary sovereign government is one that satisfies four main conditions. They must issue their own currency. They must collect taxes in that same currency. They only issue bonds or gilts denominated in that currency, debt. And they must operate under a flexible exchange rate regime. So obviously in the UK, well, I say obviously, but all four of these points apply to the UK. And there's a handful of other countries such as the US, Japan, China, Australia, and Canada that also have the same flexibility that we have. Of particular note, the Eurozone is not included here for a very good reason. The Eurozone, the individual Eurozone countries don't have any of those controls. That's all held at the superstate level, at the Euro level. And in my opinion, that's one of the major weaknesses. So who has monetary sovereignty? Well, not us or any other private citizen. No private citizen can create money. If they do, you tell the authorities and you're sent to jail. No business, large or small, irrespective of what they say about how they create wealth. They may appropriate money from other sectors of the economy, but they certainly do not create money in the sense that the government does. Not local authorities. We can all see what's happening there with the raft of bankruptcies that we're seeing. So the only entity that has monetary sovereignty is the entity that has the sole power to create money, debt-free money, that is, and that's the central government. And funnily enough, this is the same government that says that they in fact have no money, when it's actually the precise opposite. And it's really crucial that we distinguish between currency issuers, which is the central government, and currency users, who's everybody else. Everybody else in the private economy is a currency user, and it's only the central government that is actually the issuer of the currency. So how is money created in a modern economy? Well, there's only two and only two ways, both of them involving keyboards these days, keystrokes. Either keystrokes by the Bank of England into private bank reserve accounts, or keystrokes by private banks that create deposits when people or companies borrow. Those are the only two ways that money is created in the modern economy. At the moment, the vast majority of our money is created by private banks, and I think Hannah's going to touch on that in the next section of the presentation. This is a quick graph of the current money supply. So our money supply at the moment is about £3 trillion. And you can see, can I get the pointer here? Where's the laser pointer? So you can see here the golden era up until the financial crisis. You can see austerity. You can see post-austerity. You can see the little COVID blip here. And you can see where we are currently at about £3 trillion. So you don't have to take it from me. You know, this is Ben Bernanke, who is the former chairman of the Federal Reserve.
Balance sheet. Is that tax money that the Fed is spending?
It's not tax money. The banks have accounts with the Fed much the same way that you have an account in a commercial bank. So to lend to a bank, we simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account that they have with the Fed. So it's much more akin, although not exactly the same, but it's much more akin to printing money than it is to borrowing.
You've been printing money.
Well, effectively, and we need to do that because our economy is very weak. And
so that is the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, telling us very explicitly how things work. And, you know, it's quite something that we're still in this situation that this isn't any dispute, because this is Ben Bernanke speaking a number of years ago, explicitly telling people that the Federal Reserve effectively creates money when they were doing the bank bailouts in particular, which is what he was alluding to there. So we've got Ben Bernanke on one hand. We've also got the chairman of the Bundesbank here. This was a speech given by the former president of the Deutsche Bundesbank back in 2012. Central banks create money by granting commercial banks credit against collateral. And it goes on to say it does not have to acquire beforehand the money it lends, i.e. taxation, or use for payments, but it can basically create it out of thin air. And he finishes with saying the printing of money is an appropriate image here. From an economic perspective, the printing press is not necessary, as the creation of money primarily shows up on central banks' balance sheets. So this is the president of the Deutsche Bundesbank. So, you know, when I read things like this, and it's actually out there in the public domain, it never ceases to amaze me that there's still confusion that central banks and central governments don't actually have an infinite capacity to create money. We're constantly told that we don't have it. So how do commercial banks create money? Well, first of all, let's dispel one of the common misconceptions, which is banks simply act as intermediaries lending out deposits. That's not how it works. The way it actually works, and the Bank of England very helpfully laid this out in their Q1 quarterly bulletin back in 2014, that whenever a bank makes a loan, it simultaneously creates a matching deposit, thereby creating new money. So that's how bank created money. That's how deposits are created in the modern economy. The bank will look for a creditworthy borrower. They will then sign a loan note with that borrower, and they will create the money. And it is as simple as that. It doesn't come from deposits. It doesn't come from anywhere else. It is literally creating money via keystrokes. But this is debt-based money, because now the borrower obviously has to pay it back. And the vast majority, like I said, is bank money. That's about 97% of all money currently is created by commercial banks. So in theory, the money created by lending is destroyed when the loan is repaid. But in practice, I mean, if you take something like house prices, that's a good example. You know, the mortgage is paid back, and then the new mortgager will take a much bigger loan because house prices keep going up. So we do tend to see that upward sloping curve for commercial bank money in the economy. Quickly want to go through a couple of charts here. So, you know, this is in theory. This is actually how it works. So you've got the Bank of England sitting at the center of everything here. You've got the public sector here. You've got the private sector here. And the Bank of England is basically the conduit between the government and everybody else in the private sector. And very briefly, we can see here, this is a number of accounts on how the mechanics actually work, getting from the central government here via their accounts with the Bank of England down here, via Barclays and Lloyds, and then into the private sector here. And that's where everybody else gets the money. So again, you know, this isn't theoretical. There's very clear lines. And if you want to look at it, this comes from a book I purchased recently. But I also have some other resources if anybody's interested in the double entry and how everything works. So what about government spending? So this comes from a Gims piece. This is the one that I was telling you about. It's about 200 pages of double entry on how governments tax and spend. If anybody needs something to send them to sleep, but it can be quite informative if you do have an interest in these things. So I pulled out a couple of points that I've found there. The government has no provisioning requirement that it must satisfy in order to spend. That is, it has no need of taxpayers' money. The Bank of England has no choice but to grant the issue an account for credit. So the consolidated fund was one of the accounts I showed you on the previous page. Unspecified sums that are potentially large and unpredictable that are nevertheless pre-authorized by a specific act of parliament. So the money creation by governments is via acts of parliament. That's how money is created. It's not via taxation or any other money collection method. It's actually voted into existence. And if you need a recent example of this, if you go back to March 2020, at the beginning of COVID, the government realized that they needed to have a significant amount of money to pay for the furlough scheme. They voted in £120 billion in the first 3 months of 2020, which I think Hannah pointed out in one of the Positive Money articles, was also the first time that the Bank of England then directly bought those bonds. So the government created the money, the Bank of England issued the bonds, and then the Bank of England also bought those bonds. So it was, to me, that was like the myth should have been well and truly burst by that point. So when you hear that, Labour says that they can't spend £20 billion a year, well, 120 billion was created in the first 3 months, and that was in the midst of one of the largest crises that we've seen ever. So what about the Bank of England? So the Bank of England has been wholly owned by the government since 1946. In 1998, it was made operationally independent, but by law must make good any payment that the government instructs under the Exchequer and Audit Act 1866. And this matters because the government is not like us. So if the government votes in, if the government votes in a certain amount of money, a budget, for example, the Bank of England has no option but to create that money and to make sure that the accounts that need to be credited on the private side are actually credited. So, and politicians and economists pretend that the central government must first borrow or raise taxes to fund spending, but it's not the case. Government spending always comes first, and government spending, it must come first, because why would the government need to borrow something that it in fact created and it can continue to create at will? It costs nothing, no matter what they say. The actual physical creation of money is nothing more than keystrokes. But of course, there are consequences, and we'll come on to those briefly. So it's not quite as straightforward as we can get everything that we want, but the actual physical act of them creating money is very straightforward, and it really shouldn't be controversial. So a quick summary. So the UK government is the monopoly issuer of pounds. It does not need to borrow from the private sector to do this. And if you think about it, it's actually physically impossible for it to do so. So if we go back to the very beginning, if the government needed if the government needed tax money, what happened the first year that they needed to spend? If we agree that only central governments can create money, at some point they must have spent money into the economy to then be able to tax it back out. So it's not that they need that money. They must have been the creators in the first place. So it's actually impossible for them to need this tax money, because it's a real chicken and egg there. And this is another quote I have here, and they show that the government does not maintain balances from which expenditure is sourced. So that's another way of saying there is no need for taxpayers' money. And if you go through the double entry, there is indeed no taxpayers' account anywhere. It's just a balancing item on an account somewhere, and it causes such misery. So that begs the question, so what are taxes for then? Well, the textbook definition is that it creates a demand for government currency. And one way that we saw this was in colonial times. When the British went into India, they tried to get lots of Indians to work in the various enterprises, to which they said no. So the British government decided to impose a tax in pounds. And then everybody then had to sell their labor in pounds to earn the pounds to pay the tax. So that's one way that governments can actually create a demand for government currency via taxation. But the big one, I think, for our purposes is to help guard against inflation. And this is really what we should be talking about. Not whether governments can create money, because we know that they can, But what we really, the discussion should be, how can the government create more money in a non-inflationary manner? And it really depends on where it's spent, over what time periods it's spent. Is it investment? Is it for current consumption? Where is it likely to be consumed? There's a million different questions, but really the question to me is the inflationary question, not can we or can we not do it, because that's a nonsense. It can also be used to alter the distribution of income, for inequality, incentivize or disincentivize behaviors such as tobacco, and finally, it's fairly infrequently, but also to isolate certain programs such as Social Security. And by the way, national insurance doesn't go to pay for the NHS, but I thought they'd put that in there because it does happen occasionally. And what's really frustrating when I first came across this article is we've known this for a long time. Beardsley Rummel wrote this piece in January 1946, saying that taxes for revenue are obsolete. And there's this paragraph down here: the necessity for a government to tax in order to maintain both its independence and its solvency is true for state and local governments, as it is today, but it is not true for national governments. So we've known this for decades, and still it's open to question. And I'm sure that it's going to be surprising to some people today in 2024, which is really horrifying. So this is a chart of what's known as a sectoral balances chart. And when I first looked at this, I thought this was very interesting. So what we have here is a sectoral chart, a sectoral balances chart for the US. So the red lines are the government deficits. The blue lines are the private sector surpluses. So that's corporates, households, and the financial sector. And then the green is the capital accounts, which is basically imports or net imports. And obviously, what's striking here is it's a mirror image. So, when we're looking at these red lines here, which are the government deficits, we see that there is a corresponding positive number, positive surplus in the private sector. So anybody that says that they want to minimize or even, imagine bringing the governments into surplus, by definition, by accounting identity, means you will be destroying the private sector surplus. And when you have polls like this, people that don't understand sectoral balances, they don't understand how it works. Do you support or oppose returning the country to a balanced budget? Well, if you ask that question, most people would say yes. And indeed here, 81% of the people said yes. But I think if people truly understood what that means, a destruction of the private sector surplus, that would soon flip, maybe 90-10 against. So I actually did this for the UK. So this is a sectoral balances chart. So I went to the ONS, I downloaded the spreadsheet, I did the calculations, and I'm glad to say that it kind of looks similar. We still have a very similar mirror image, but you can see here that these are the government deficits that we tend to run. There was a very brief period alongside with the US where we ran surpluses. But what's interesting here is while we were running a surplus, you can see that the private sector was then forced into a deficit position. Now, what we don't know, was that corporate debt, was that financials, was that households, but somebody somewhere in the private sector was forced into a negative position because the government chose to maintain a positive one. So the government deficit is the private sector surplus, and the government deficit is simply untaxed government spending. It's nothing more difficult than that. And if here we can see the 39 advanced economies, there's nothing unusual about a deficit. So this is an average of the 39 different economies. It doesn't look that dissimilar to ours. So, we're not an outlier, no matter what the papers say. So briefly onto the national debt, we can see here, the top line here is the national debt. This is as a percentage of GDP. We're currently hovering around 100%, which we're told is a catastrophe. We must get debt down during the next parliament or whatever nonsense we're told. But if you look back historically, there really is nothing to be concerned about from what I can see. There's been many, many periods historically when we've been above the 100%. And some of these times we're actually on a gold standard, which makes it extremely painful to be running deficits like this if you're on a gold standard. We've been in a fiat currency since 1973 or 1971, and we don't have anything like those constraints. So what is the national debt? The national debt is simply a total of all the previous debt. So if you take all of those red lines or red bars from my previous chart and you add them all together, that gets you to the national debt. What a lot of people aren't clear on is actually national savings investment is part of the national debt. So I think we're currently 2.4 trillion, 207 billion of that is NS&I, and another 390 billion is pension funds. And in fact, I read a piece recently that up to $1 trillion is actually in pension funds. So about 50% of our national debt is actually private sector savings, which again illustrates the case that I was telling you before. And national debt it's simply private sector savings, and savings are good, right? So I will go past the currency collapse, and I'll just finish up here. So what are the constraints? So the primary constraint in terms of creating money is inflation, and by extension, the productive output of the economy. So really what we need to be talking about is how do we increase the productive output of the economy? If you look at what the ONS is saying, if you look at what I think both Labour and the Conservatives are saying, is they want to cut investment. By definition, that is going to impact the productive output of our economy, which is a catastrophe. You know, if there's insufficient capacity in relation to demand, then all additional spending will do is it will just raise prices. So we really need to change the tone of the debate. So I think that's my 20 minutes. That's a brief run through of money creation, debts, deficits, and I will hand over to Hannah.
Okay. Can you take that screen? Thank you. Okay, well, that was very interesting and still very difficult for me to get a grip of. So if you can put anything in the chat to Zoe, any books that you think would be useful to us, that would be fantastic. Thank you very much for that. So we're going to go on to our second speaker now, which is Hannah Dewhirst, and she's head of campaigns at Positive Money, which is an organisation I must admit that I hadn't heard of, but it's an advocacy group with a mission to promote reform of central banks and an alternative monetary policy. So Hannah, your turn. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan, and thanks so much, Zoe, for inviting me to join you. I'll start by saying apologies, there might be some repetition from Vincent's presentation, but who knows, maybe that will help you remember things, I don't know. And also to say it's sometimes tricky to pitch these presentations, you know, how much detail to go into or how much not to. So I'm also very welcome to hear feedback from everyone, and if you don't want to say it to my face now, you can email Zoe and she can pass it on later. But yeah, as I mentioned, my name is Hannah Dewhirst. I'm the head of campaigns at Positive Money.
Hannah, sorry, can I just stop you for a second, Hannah? Is it possible for you to turn your volume up? I can just about hear it, but it's not very loud compared to the previous speaker. Is it possible for you?
I'll try moving things closer. 1 second. And speaking a bit louder. Is that better?
Yeah, I think that's a little bit better. Yes, thank you. Thanks. Sorry for interrupting.
No worries. Sorry about that. Yes, so my name's Hannah Dewhirst. I'm the head of campaigns at Positive Money. We're a research and campaign organisation. So I'm also going to start off a bit by talking about money and our banking system, how it works and the problems it causes, and then go on to talk in a little bit more detail about our organisation and what we do. And then hopefully we can answer some good Q&A. So you don't really need me to tell you that there are multiple crises facing us in the UK at the moment. There's the housing crisis, there's the cost of living crisis, whether that's greedflation or stagnant wages that we've seen for the last decade or more. We're also facing climate catastrophe, environmental breakdown, biodiversity loss, and we've also just seen a complete breakdown in public services, both at a national and local level, as has been mentioned. Now, there are obviously multiple number of reasons why we're in the position that we're in, and different people have different thoughts and analysis on why we're here. A far right person might say, oh, a lot of this is because of, you know, refugees or immigration. A far left person might say, well, this is just the natural result of capitalism. At Positive Money, our response would really be that underlying all these multiple crises is our broken money and banking system. So that's not to say the money and banking system is the only cause of all these things, but we believe that the one we have at the moment has kind of led to a lot of the breakdowns and issues that we're seeing. I'll go into that in a bit more detail. But yeah, just start a bit also as Vincent had on that big question of what is money. If you sort of stop most people in the street, their first reaction is probably cash, like the notes and coins that I'm carrying around in my pocket or my purse. And this is true to an extent, and cash is our only form of public money. I guess where we might differ with Vincent a bit, but we can get into that. You know, if you look at your £10 note, you'll see it's signed by the chief cashier of the Bank of England. It's printed by the Bank of England. No, they've actually outsourced the printing of it now, but it's a separate matter. And it, you know, bears the picture of our monarch. But physical cash only represents about 4% of the money supply in the UK. So if that's only 4%, what is the other 96%? And that has been mentioned, is it's electronic. So you'll probably recognise this picture is pretty much what most of us will see if we log into our current accounts that are all held with usually private banks, the big four in the UK being HSBC, Lloyds, Barclays, NatWest. But that can also be represented in terms of 1s, 0s and loads of codes on computers. So again, this touches a bit on what Vincent's already discussed, but I'll just repeat for the sake of, you know, clarity for some, is that if this money is electronic, where does it come from and who makes it? Well, it's primarily private banks creating money when they make loans. So again, this very much denies kind of the old belief that banks are simply intermediaries or, you know, middlemen between savers and borrowers. So, you know, and this is how a lot of banks used to work about 50, 100 years ago. You know, if I had £100, I might go down to the local bank, pop it in, hoping to get some interest in about a year. They'd take that money and go and lend it to a small business that was looking for money to, you know, improve their productive capacity or output. They'd pay that loan back, and then that bank would give me my money back with my interest. But that's not really how it works at all. And quite a simple way to see this is to look at a bank's balance sheet. That, you know, by law, they're required to be transparent to an extent. You can see how much they hold in deposits, and then you can see how much they lend out. And there's a big difference between those two numbers. So if you're looking at those, you can instantly see, well, what's going on here. You know, they're lending out more than they're bringing in. And that's because every time they make new loans, that they're creating money in the economy. And as Vincent mentioned, while organisations like us and lots of economists have been saying this for a very long time, it's only quite recently that big institutions like the Bank of England have actually come forward and been truthful about it. So in 2014, in one of their formal publications, they came out and agreed with us by saying that, yes, commercial banks do create money in the form of deposits when they make new loans. So that was a bit of a victory, though, as Vincent has touched on, sadly, even though, you know, it's technically in the public sphere, this isn't very well known still. So part of our work is to try and raise awareness about that with as many people as possible. And one of the reasons this sort of myth continues to be perpetuated and circulated is because that's what economists still get taught. So if you're studying A-level economics or you go and study at uni, there's a quote here from Adair Turner, who's a former Financial Standards Authority chair and consulting with politicians and banks about economics, is that the textbooks still repeat this myth that banks take money from borrowers or households and then they'll lend that out. But in his words, this is completely mythological, as me and Vincent have touched on. If you are interested more in kind of education reform, I'll give a shout out to a group called Rethinking Economics, which, full transparency, I used to work for, that works with students in universities to try and reform their curricula, to try and get the truth into their textbooks. Because if this myth keeps being repeated, then we're not really going to get anywhere. So education is definitely part of the solution here. So now that we've kind of got a sense that the vast majority of money in the economy is from private banks when they make loans, where do those loans go? So this is a snapshot. These figures are actually from 2018, but very roughly the percentage breakdowns across sectors are still very similar today, so haven't updated it. So about 50% of all that private bank lending goes towards mortgages, and that obviously has huge knock-on effects for the housing crisis, which I'll circle back to later, but Vince has already mentioned. About 17% goes this to non-financial businesses, and this is pretty much what average people would think loans go to. You know, maybe there's a local bakery that wants to increase the size of their production, so they might go to their bank and ask for a loan so that they can either buy another oven or hire another member of staff. hopefully over the years that will mean that they can bake more bread, make more money, and then they'll go and repay that loan. But that's only about 17% of lending. A much bigger chunk, about a quarter, goes to financial activity. And I'm not going to go into this into too much detail, but it kind of speaks to a phenomenon called financialization that we've seen happen for 10, 20 years, and it's growing, which is basically people making money out of money. And it doesn't really add any productive capacity or new outputs to the economy. So in that situation I mentioned, instead of a bakery owner, taking out a loan to increase the amount of bread they'll end up making, might be someone who comes along, takes out a bank loan just to go and buy a bakery chain like Greggs, then just hold on to it for a couple of years, see it increase in value, then they'll sell it on again. And they've made money, or maybe they might buy a business, make it public, sell a bunch to shareholders, make money. So that's it, they're sort of making money out of money, and that has dire consequences as well. And then lastly, we've got just 5% here for personal loans, credit card debt, which we've also seen increase, and there's obviously a huge burden to people, especially with soaring interest rates in the last few years. But in terms of all the money that's floating around in our economy, it's actually a relatively small percent. And then final two for government, which touches on bonds and other things, which I won't dive into tonight. So now that we've got a sense of, this is how money generally works in the system, this is where it's going, what does that mean? So one of the consequences this system has is it causes financial crises. So as we saw, most notably back in 2007, 2008, and I've got another quote from Adair Turner here, all that bank lending, led to a huge amount of credit that was available in the economy. And again, obviously within housing as well, just saw more and more people borrowing, probably, and it was completely deregulated, taking too much credit. And then obviously the rise of, business financial loans as well, and just spiraled, and then we led up to the crash. And that hasn't stopped. No one seems to have learnt much from them, because we still see it happening. We even saw it happening at the start of last year in America with Silicon Valley Bank, and in Europe with Credit Suisse. So this financial instability is inherent to the system. And if so, that means we don't really change things. We're just going to continue seeing crises after crisis after crises. And another consequence, as I mentioned earlier, is the housing crisis. And as Vincent mentioned as well, we've seen kind of house prices soar over the last few decades. And there's definitely a few factors going on here, the selling off of social housing stock being one of them. But it really goes hand in hand with the huge expansion in mortgage lending that we've seen private banks oversee. And if you're more interested in housing as a topic, I'd recommend our report, Banking on Property, which my colleague Denisha led came out in 2022. So you can go and have a read of that if you want to get really into the details of this, and also read some of our recommendations on housing specifically. So the other side of the coin of private money creation is public money creation. So as Vincent also touched on, and this is just a clip from, if you can cast your minds back to when our Prime Minister was Theresa May, and she was running in the 2017 general election. She was asked by a nurse why she hadn't had a pay rise in 8 years. And Theresa May's response during the public debate was that, well, there's no magic money tree. And, that's a line that we continually hear repeated by politicians from across the political spectrum. It's not just the Conservatives. But really that's not true. There definitely is a magic money tree, and it is the Bank of England and the Treasury. So yeah, again, apologies for a bit of a repeat here, but hopefully some new information as well. So the Bank of England obviously has the power to print physical cash, but it can also create money digitally in a process that recently termed quantitative easing. So they did this after the 2008 financial crisis. They created £445 billion. And what did they do with it? Well, if you, or maybe if I were in charge, could have used it to give NHS workers a pay rise, or to give free school meals for children, or, buy back some rail services. But they didn't decide to do any of that. They decided to use it to buy up private financial assets, mostly from banks. And that was really with the intention of shoring up those private banks. Because like another instability that's inherent in the system is that if the majority of money is held by banks, then if they crash, we lose a huge amount of currency. And as well as being the people handing out loans, banks therefore oversee like most of the pounds that are circulating in our system. So if a bank crashes, you can't go to your ATM, then that financial transactions become completely curtailed. And we saw this with Northern Rock. And it's like governments are incentivized to jump in and save them. Because if all the banks collapsed, how would we be able to live our lives and go to the shops and pay for things? So that's like another big problem in the system, is that the government is really propping up this system of private banks, even though it collapses and crashes. And it means that we're kind of really beholden to them for our economy to function. And by giving most of this newly created money to big private assets, it meant that it didn't really filter down to the normal economy, to you and I, as I'm sure we're all aware. Nothing really got better after the 2008 financial crash. And some research has showed that of every pound of new money that was made, only about 8p ended up filtering through to the real economy. But did they learn anything from that? Not really. They just did it all again after COVID. One of the schemes they set up, a very catchy title, COVID Corporate Financing Facility, and they printed hundreds of billions more. And I've just put some figures there. 600 million ended up going to EasyJet and 300 million to British Airways. And I've picked 2 airlines as an example because we ran a campaign at that time saying, well, if the Bank of England's going to create all this new money and hand it out, maybe they should direct it towards, good things like, renewable energy or insulating our homes. Maybe there should be some purpose or conditions attached to it. But they didn't do any of that. They just sort of handed it out to the companies that they were most interested in seeing continue to succeed. And for this current sort of government, that's big businesses and airlines being an example of that. So they walked off with sort of hundreds of £1 million of new money and continued to operate as is. So we've sort of laid out the things here. I'm sort of happy to say that after sitting through Vincent and mine's presentation, you now know more than 85% of MPs do about how money works. This is from a poll that we ran a couple of years ago, and they really didn't know anything about this private money creation or public money creation. And our hope is to run another poll after the next general election, whenever that one ends up happening, when we get a new crop of MPs, to see if there's been any change. But I'll be honest, I'd be surprised if that number has fallen significantly, because there still is a huge lack of awareness really about how the system works. So that's kind of where things are now. What's the alternative? I'll try and not end on a massive depressing note. So at Positive Money, our vision is kind of very ambitious, but we would hope by bringing in a raft of reforms to our monetary and banking system, we would see the curtail of house price growth. We would sort of bring that under control. We would see an end to austerity, because we would have busted this myth that, there is no magic money tree. Governments would be able to spend more. We would also love to see the creation of more public banks, cooperative banks, credit unions, to really push back against the monopoly power that the big 4 banks have in our economy. We also advocate for the introduction of a digital pound. So that would be an electronic version of cash. So that would be public money created by the Bank of England, but it would all be digital. So you might, for instance, be able to have a current account with the Bank of England instead of with Barclays, if you didn't want your money sitting with Barclays and doing all the bad things that Barclays ends up doing with it. Ultimately, this would really tip the balance of where power sits in our country, and hopefully push back against a lot of inequalities that we're seeing. We would hopefully see a reduction in private debt, and we would hopefully also encourage more investment in green projects and public investment in greener alternatives to try and obviously hit those climate goals that we have, and to try and stop the world burning, because people think money's finite, but actually it's the planet that is. So we've got to pay heed to that. So what do we actually do to try and help us get there? So Positive Money has 3 arms. We've got research, policy and advocacy team, and a campaigns team. So we sort of produce research like the banking on property report that I mentioned earlier, as well as shorter briefings. So my colleague Denisha runs that team. Current projects, one on looking how we finance the green transition. And then she's also working on a wider project, which is mapping the entire international monetary and financial system, because this stuff doesn't just stop at the borders of the UK. We've got to take into account the global scale of this. We aim to get coverage in the press, so members of our team will do interviews, or we'll try and get articles in mainstream newspapers to try and spread our ideas and get attention and raise awareness about all of this. My colleague Simon, who runs our advocacy team, will reach out to MPs and politicians and civil servants at the Bank of England to try and get ideas in front of them, try and get meetings with the people who have the power to change things. So we might run events at party conferences or do other sort of ad hoc events. And then we also have an amazing supporter network, and that's the bit that I get to oversee. So we have about 20,000 people on our mailing list, and we run campaigns involving petitions and actions to MPs, and we do stunts outside the Bank of England. So if you're ever there on an interest rate decision day, we probably will be as well. So come say hello. We also have some international colleagues. So we've got an office in Brussels that does similar work aimed at the European Central Bank. And then a very small but growing presence in the US as well, because the Federal Reserve is in a similar position to the Bank of England here. Just a few more detailed examples of our policy asks. So yeah, as I mentioned, our green work. So we aim to green the Bank of England. So we want a green mandate for the bank in 2021 that has had some positive impact, but unfortunately Jeremy Hunt took it out in his last budget, so that was disappointing to see, and that's kind of why this fight never really ends, because politics never really ends. But you know, we'll keep pushing for that, as well as wider changes to the financial system, because another really important role of the Bank of England is the regulator of private banks. So if it made changes to what banks would be able to lend to or not, that would have huge ramifications for the economy. The digital pound, which I've already mentioned. We also do work trying to highlight the power of the financial lobby. So we brought out a report called The Power of Big Finance last year, year before, about like basically listing how many meetings big bank lobbyists have with MPs and politicians every day, and how they're kind of able to outspend and, you know, get the ear of the regulators, while people like us kind of struggle to even get in the door. And then lastly, a current campaign we're running is called Tax the Banks. And it's calling for the introduction of a windfall tax on banks, because they've seen huge soaring profits over the last 2 years as interest rates have shot up, while we've all been suffering from the cost of living crisis. So we're calling for the introduction of a windfall tax on banks, similar to the one that was introduced on energy companies, because they've also benefited from rising prices over the last few years. And that petition is still running, so if you'd like to add your name, I can share links with Zoe afterwards. And our current plan is to do a hand-in of that before the spring budget in March. So hopefully that's a little bit of a taste of what we're all about. But yeah, hopefully that was interesting enough and it's not been too confusing, but very happy to answer any more questions people have. So yeah, if you like the sound of what you've heard, then please consider signing up to our mailing list or following us online. We also rely on supporter donations, that would be always welcome. Or just keep an eye out for our events.
Okay. If we can take the screen down. Thank you. Thank you very much, Hannah. Another very interesting talk there. Again, if you have any specific ideas for stuff that we might find useful, I know you had that stuff at the end, and we can always go to the website. But if you've got specific things that you think the people that are here tonight might find useful, please pass the details to Zoe, and she'll make sure that she sends it round to everybody. Whilst you've been talking, I don't know whether you were seeing it, but I was seeing loads of questions were already going into the chat, people asking each other questions. So I'm not going to take any notice of the chat. I'm going to take the hands that are up, and I've got Stephen Hayes first and then Lynn Jones. Stephen.
Yeah, actually, Lynn had her hand up before me, but maybe I can just quickly ask the question. The term I know is propensity to import, and basically it says if you put money in people's pockets, you put money out there, people will spend a proportion of it on imports. New cars, foreign holidays, things like that, and also businesses will do the same, which tends to create a balance of payments crisis. And this has been recognized. I know when I was young, we used to hear about coordinated reflation, where all the Western economies, because they were the only ones in those days really, would expand their economies at the same time so that it all balanced out. I just wondered what would be the suggested way of dealing with this. I mean, the two obvious things would be either to have some sort of import controls, which I don't think we can do, or to just allow the pound to fall to where people can't afford to spend it on imports. But maybe there's an answer I'd like to hear.
Totally disagree. I totally disagree. I mean, first of all, we could stop nurses going to food banks. We could prevent people from freezing to death in their homes. You know, none of this will involve import spending or fancy cars. I think there's a tremendous amount that we could do today to alleviate the suffering that we have in this country without any inflationary impact at all. You know, we could hire more resources, more human resources into our caring professions. They're not going to go and buy a Mercedes. You know, they're going to be working for near the minimum wage. So I think we need to be careful about, now I understand that is a limiting factor, but I think there's a tremendous amount that we could do to alleviate the suffering of millions of people without any consideration of inflation.
Okay, thank you. Look, I've got a list of people already. What we'll do, We'll take
Ivan?
3 questions. I know, Zoe, I did catch Yvonne.
Okay, good.
So I'm going to take 3 questions and then I will let the 2 speakers come in. Please keep the questions brief. We've got just over half an hour and we've already got 6 people waiting to come in. So if you can keep your comments or your questions brief. So Lynn, please, next.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
I'm unmuted. Yeah, I just, there's lots I want to say, but I think, and first of all, the point I'd like to make is all this isn't theory. This is actually how money is created. It's real. It's not theory. People talk about modern monetary theory. This is real. This is what happens. And I think, I'm kind of, aware of this. Please buy the 99% book. Please subscribe to 99% and Positive Money, as I do. But the point, and there are lots I want to say, but I won't. But I think what might confuse people is the difference between debt and deficit. And I think it's important that we understand that. So maybe one of the speakers might like to address this.
Thank you, Lynn. Russ, and then I'll let the speakers back in to respond. Russ Casey, please.
Yeah, thanks. You mentioned like quantitative easing and where we had to take quantitative easing at the banking crisis and again in COVID. Do I take it that money added to the national debt and therefore has to be paid back to the Bank of England and with interest? So that in effect is money we are actually taking out of the economy to pay ourselves as a country. Is that right, or is my thinking way off? My understanding way off? And how much of a proportion do we actually, as that national debt, is owed to the Bank of England and not owed to ourselves? Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Ross. So, would either of you like to respond? Maybe Hannah first, as Vincent has responded last time. So Hannah first, then Vincent, if he wants to come in. Hannah?
Yeah, I mean, I'll do my best. I'm not from our research team, so I don't have as much the detailed information on this. But I would echo firstly what was mentioned from Lynn, that this, if apologies for that, was the right speaker. This isn't theory. This is all real and affecting us every day. And I mean, the recent work we've been doing to try and tackle high interest rates, that's because it's impacting all of us. In terms of like how much debt, so I mean, as far as I know, there's no interest that is paid between the government and the Treasury and the Bank of England. But I guess that's where it's all a bit confusing, is that the Bank of England is wholly owned by the government. Like, it's the Chancellor that appoints the governor and members of the MPC. And so yeah, I mean, I think Vincent would be able to give a lot more detail here, but it's not really, that much of an issue. And in terms of, I don't have the levels of private debt. I apologise. Yeah, I'm not really able to answer these questions very well, I'm afraid.
That's fine. Thank you. Vincent?
Okay, I'm just looking up the latest numbers for Bank of England debt. Okay, the debt and the deficit the deficit is accumulated. The national debt is accumulated deficits. So if the government if the difference between spending and expenditure in 1 year is 10 billion pounds, the government will issue 10 billion pounds of debt. The national debt is 10 billion pounds. If the next year there's another 10 billion pounds deficit, the government will issue 10 billion pounds. The national debt is now 20 billion pounds. And it's basically that cumulative amount of all the red lines in that chart that I showed you equates to the national debt. Now, all that is untaxed spending. So, this is something that people really need to understand. Like all the government guilt is deferred spending. So when the government borrows 10 billion pounds, they say, okay, the difference between in our ledger, that's all it is, an electronic ledger, we spend 100 billion, we offset 90 billion of that with taxation. So there's a gap of 10 billion. So what they do is the Bank of England will issue 10 billion pounds of debt. Now that debt, all that is the government is saying in 10 years' time or 20 years' time, we're going to create 10 billion pounds to pay it back. It's not a credit card. It's not like we don't have to give gold or, you know, any kind of physical commodity. We're literally saying we can either create 10 billion pounds today, or we can create 10 billion pounds in 10 years' time. Either way, you're going to get your 10 billion pounds back. So it's a real misnomer that there's a difference between 10 billion pounds in your hand and 10 billion pounds in debt. It's the same thing. It's just a time limited currency, you know, but people are terrified of it. You know, people love the fact of having 10 billion pounds in their hand. They're terrified of this 10 billion pounds of debt. And all it is 10 billion pounds in cash in 10 years' time. The question we should be asking is the economy going to be capable of absorbing that spending in 10 years' time? Can we, you know, we need, if we're going to be issuing this money, we need to build up the productive capacity of the economy so that when that time comes, there's stuff to buy. You know, there's a video I didn't have time to show you with Alan Greenspan, where he's talking about pensioners. And he does a wonderful job of explaining how there's no such thing as a pension crisis, because in 50 years' time, we can pay our pensioners whatever we want because we can create as much money as we want. The question is there going to be anything for the pensioners to spend it on? You know, the things that they're going to need. So what we need, or what governments need to be focusing on, is making sure that those goods and services are available. You know, the care services, the housing, all the things that people are going to need. The money is irrelevant. But that seems to be where we stop. I'll get the numbers for the national debt, the debt owned by the Bank of England. I need to go to the Bank of England website. It's all there, publicly available. I was only looking at it last week, but the number escapes me now.
Okay, thank you, Vincent. I'm going to take another 3 questions, I think. And I've got people down as I'm noticing them. So as soon as your hand goes up, including that physical hand, which I have seen, Yvonne, so you're on the list. I'm going to take Ian first, then Yvonne, and then Christopher Hall. So
okay,
Ian.
thanks. Thank you. I'm trying to make this very simple. I cannot get my head around this concept very much, but I would like to ask the practical question: how could you move the existing money system towards this positive money ideal? How would you physically or electronically start a movement in that direction?
Okay, thanks, Ian. Yvonne?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, fine. Okay. Thank you very much, Hannah. Hannah, I will look up your website immediately after this. And thank you very much indeed, Vincent, for your very clear exposition of the "there's no money available" myth. Thank you. Now, sort of a political question really that perhaps one or both of you could answer. We can see why Tories have an ideological obsession with peddling this myth. It is a brilliant way to kick the poor. I don't fully understand is why our new Labour government of also obviously going to carry on with this myth. Now, clearly, somebody like Reeves, she's a banker. She must know that this is completely illogical. So why do you think they're going to carry on with it, other than a desire to be right, however illogical they are? What do you think your reason? What do you think is going on there?
Okay, thanks, Yvonne. And I'm going to take one more and then they can respond. So, Christopher Hall, please.
And following on from those last 2 questions, I think we're all edging in a similar sort of a direction. My question is, so would you use the same methodology? And I say, for example, quantitative easing, perhaps though with a question mark there about the naming of that methodology. Would you rename it? And would it be applied to things differently from the current government, for example, so that you would apply it, of course, to our public services and paying higher wages? Or is my little assessment there both too crude and too inaccurate? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Who wants to go first? Hannah?
Good questions. So Ian, yeah, practical changes. So obviously there's a lot that needs changing. But I guess that's why we have I forget how many policy proposals we have altogether, but lots. So I guess one thing you could do is, as I mentioned towards the end of my presentation, is the Bank of England is a regulator of the private banking system. So if we got the Bank of England to change the regulation, i.e. by encouraging banks to hold more collateral for the lending that they do, or to hold higher collateral for certain types of lending, for example, towards fossil fuel, intensive industries, or, natural gas exports or something like that, that would start to tip the balance of where this money goes in the system. So back to that chart I showed where 50% goes to mortgages and etc. That would be another way. So within the housing report, some things we look at is maybe ending buy-to-let mortgages. So you just can't get a mortgage if you're just going to plan on then renting that house out to somebody else. So that would be one of the things that we could do to alter how credit flows towards houses. And alongside that as well, as I mentioned, the digital pound that we'd advocate in, if loads and loads of people moved their money out of private banks and had their just current account at the Bank of England, that would also remove a huge amount of power away from private banks and start to tilt the system in that direction. So that's just a couple of examples there. Yvonne's question on Labour. Yeah, I mean, I think sadly here this is touching on the lobbying question that issue that I raised, is that because unfortunately they're still prey to the massive finance lobby that has been in the Conservatives' ear for decades. It was Labour that introduced PFIs, private finance initiatives, and that's what we're going to see a second round of probably. Like when Labour talk about this 28 billion for investing in green things, they say that's going to be only about a quarter of all the private finance they want to encourage, and that's because that's where their friends are going to be making the money from at the end of the day. So, but that's not to say that's only just Labour. That's unfortunately what we see of the raft of all major parties advocating for, because they're just not willing to kind of really shatter this narrative, because it really would just turn everything on its head. And I guess that sort of carries on to your question, Christopher. This is not crude to say that at all. No, please don't think that. I mean, in an ideal world, it'd be great if we could have another round of quantitative easing like the one we have after COVID, but use it for good things. But, given the impact that that's had and the high inflationary environment we're currently living in, that's probably not the best thing to do in this way. And unfortunately, I think even though we need to see huge changes, it's going to have to be an incremental process. But that's definitely where we want to be getting more and more to, so that public money is used for public good and it doesn't just end up in the pocket of private shareholders and the big banks. So you've got the right idea.
Okay, thanks, Hannah. Vincent, anything that you would like to say?
Yeah, I'll be very brief. On the Bank of England, the digital pound, I was actually I was on the Citizens Committee that we had a chance to meet with the Bank of England. They expressed zero interest in doing anything I actually raised the question with them, and I said it could be a brilliant idea if we could actually bank directly with the Bank of England, and we wouldn't need to go to private banks. It would be, it would really give people some security. They expressed no interest in doing that. So I hate to disappoint everybody, but there's no chance that the Bank of England is going to do anything like positive money, and I think a lot of people would like to see, sadly. In terms of why is Labour doing this, to me, it goes beyond politics. This is neoliberalism. When you have a certain economic mindset, a view of the economy, it doesn't matter what your political views are. And I think this explains why we have Trump. This explains a lot of what we're seeing, the dysfunctions in politics in Europe. Everybody has the same economic view, which is failing. So, it looks like we're doing exactly the same thing. So, hopefully at some point things change, but maybe not this election. Yeah, and the People's QE, absolutely. There's nothing stopping it whatsoever. And the inflation question, like I said, there are billions and billions that we could spend, which I am confident would have zero inflationary impact. Inflation, in the sense that we're talking about, is too much money chasing too few goods. If you give people the ability to feed themselves, warm their homes, survive, that is non-inflationary spending. There is no way, unless we don't have enough carrots, unless we don't have enough food, it's a nonsense to think that it's going to lead to hyperinflation. And I think, above what is inflationary is when you give too much money to people that have money, in terms of Mercedes and holidays and things, because of course that's what they're going to do. But there's a number of things we could do before that's an issue.
Okay, thanks, Vincent. I'm going to take three more from my list. Anthony Wedlake first. Dawn McGuinness did have her hand up. If she doesn't want to speak now, that's fine. But I've got Dawn McGuinness then, and then Sean. So, Anthony Wedlake, please.
Thank you. It's not so much a question, it's more just a contribution to the discussion in terms of information. I'm not an economist, so a little bit of knowledge is always dangerous. But until I'm now a retired director of a building society, and just to give some idea with regards to the money that's pumped into the banking sector, a relatively tiny regional building society, we've got over 90 million pounds supporting our liquidity and our business model. And we estimate, although it's not published anywhere, well, you can use the published numbers, that overall the banks and building societies, overwhelmingly the banks, have over 200 billion. No, sorry, potentially of this money sloshing around. You can just imagine what it would be doing if it was for the benefit of the 99%. But the other point is to bring a little bit closer to home, because I take the point with regards to the textbook of where banks make money. But actually at a local level, Bank Cambria, which was a mutual bank for Wales, which at the moment is stalled because the partnership with Monmouth Building Society is dead in the water. But that actually makes a massive difference on the ground, because instead of overwhelmingly the business model would be great giving working class people access to current accounts. But what it also do is actually create a lot of money from SMEs who get absolutely slaughtered by the banking industry, and they see the money that is really cheap access for banks squandered in the city, and it's a very southeast centric investment of small businesses money that are scattered equally right across the UK. So if you can have a mutual bank where those SMEs bank, they will get better access for funding to support their businesses, but will create income that can be reinvested back into the communities in which they work, and our communities. And in doing so, we'll have all sorts of other ripple effects, like supporting the high street, because they tend to open in libraries, use existing community buildings for community banks. I know there's models right across the world that shows we're actually an outlier in terms of regional and community, if not community banks, at least regional banks, where investment stays where the money is actually placed into the economy. So there's some real examples. What a massive difference that would make, Bank Cambria would make if it got off the ground. And it's probably why a lot of organisations are actively sort of undermining the sort of regional mutual banking phenomenon at the moment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. Dawn has indicated that her question has been covered by others already asked. I think that's what she indicated anyway. I saw it on my screen for a second. So I'm moving down to Sean, and then it'll be Alexander.
Thank you very much, Ivan. Thank you very much, folks, for coming along to speak to us. Hope you got over the Severn Bridge okay. We used to have a small group discussing these things in our here amongst this group, and I had two colleagues, and they used to try to explain this to me, and they failed dismally, like not to their explanation. But I think it needs some sort of an economic paradigm shift, a head shift. I've read everything there is to read about it, and I still don't understand it. But one of the things actually you could have said, which you should have said, was that the Japanese debt is 3 times Japanese gross national product, and they're not worried. I think America's debt is way over 100% the gross national product as well.
If you watch my hour presentation, I go through Japan. I didn't have time.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
One of my main points. Absolutely.
I appreciate
250% debt to GDP. Yeah.
Yeah, and what someone mentioned there, the whole notion of the financialization. See, I read Grace Blakely's book on financialization of the British economy, I recommend it to anybody. It's an easy enough book to read, and having read that, I thought we're all screwed. And although you say neoliberalism, Vincent, it's a political concept. It's not just an economic one, neoliberalism. The whole point of neoliberalism, it ties in with financialization, I'd say. And the whole point of this is to discipline and screw the workforce, labor. You can't go on strike anymore. Everybody's up to their bollocks in debt, like, you know, and everybody is struggling. So that's one of the issues around it. And I can understand why the status quo don't want to let go of that system, because they don't want to return to the 70s system. Neither of you will have been around in the 70s, the best time ever, I can assure you. And when there was, I remember the evening news in London used to have 4 or 5 pages
Wind
of
up,
buildings.
Sean.
Yeah, right. Oh, yeah. That's about it, folks. Then thank you very much, and I will join you and get back to sort of seeing if I can get my head around it. Thanks.
It's interesting, Sean, that you said that you've read everything there is about it and you still don't understand it. It's a bit like quantum physics. I think it's the same thing. You understand it when you're reading about it, but as soon as you put the book down and try to carry on thinking about it in your head, it all dissipates into the air. I think we have got Alexander next, please.
Right, thank you. I just want to I'll make this as short as possible. Money is a representation of economic activity. So if you don't increase the economic activity, but you increase the amount of money, then that money has got less spending power. It's worth less. So with the latest quantitative easing, you know, it's increased the cost of living for people. So people's money is worth less. So they're making the poorest people poorer, while some of the richest people got richer. I think the problem is not the money supply, it's the way the money flows. I think there's a big problem with our economy compared to other countries in that the financial services tends to invest their money into gaining fixed assets rather than increasing economic activity. So people buy land, they buy houses, and all that does is have an inflationary effect rather than increasing, like spending money on bringing up a new business that's going to employ people. So I think there's 2 things we could do. We could have the government invest in businesses like they've done in America with the Biden's Inflationary Reduction Act, which I think has done a lot to stimulate their economy. And before that, they had a stimulus as well from during the Obama years, whereas we went the opposite way with austerity. And I feel that we need to move the money. Investors need to be forced to put their money into increasing the economic activity rather than buying fixed assets, which is just inflationary. And we could do that through taxation, because a lot of the taxation, like income tax, avoid most richest people just tend to avoid it. It's all the money is going offshore and going into inflationary assets. Is if we can have things like a land value tax, I think would be a good way to change how our economy works. I just wanted to make those points and see what our speakers think of those suggestions.
Thank you, Alexander. Hannah, do you want to respond to any of those points?
Yeah, another raft of great questions. Yeah, Anthony, completely agree in terms of, you know, banking is almost like as oligopolistic as loads of other sectors in our country. Like there's only 4 big supermarkets, there's only 4 big banks, and that's, you know, because they make more money that way. But we do need to see a flourishing of regional and local cooperative banks, alternative sources of credit like credit unions, you know, more building societies. All of that would be grand. And I absolutely agree with you. If we had more of sort of that local and regional based lending, we would see more then end up with small and medium sized businesses. You know, we'd hopefully see that 17% of lending, you know, shoot up, because that's the actual productive sector of our economy that people get jobs in, that people get goods and services that they want from. And another thing to mention is this ties in a work with, there's another great organisation called the Centre of Local Economic Strategies, CLERS, and they do a lot of work on anchor institutions. They're like businesses that can't move. They're like football stadiums or universities. And if, you know, they used all their resources just to buy local goods and services, the money would stay in the community and would circulate, instead of what's happening now, which gets sucked up by national or international banks, and then that ends up in the pockets of shareholders, and it all gets sucked away. So yeah, definitely agree with you. Yeah, Sean, definitely internationally, yeah, those are great comparisons to make. And just touch on your point that like it is a political project, it's fear mongering, the same way that they're pointing the finger at the refugees, you know, the same way they're pointing their finger and saying, well, we haven't got any money, the government's a household, we need to balance our books. It's fear mongering. It's done to like scare us into the policies that they want to push through that don't benefit us. And then, yeah, lastly, Alexander, on your points, definitely something like the Inflation Reduction Act, obviously that would be wonderful to see here. And I guess a wider point is obviously like we have a lot of proposals for changing our monetary policy, but that's not the only way we're going to tackle these questions. We absolutely need to see changes in taxation. Tax Justice UK does some great work, you know, and as was mentioned in Vincent's presentation, you know, taxes are in part to redistribute wealth, and we need to do a lot of redistribution of wealth in our country. So that's definitely also going to be part of the solution as well.
Thank you, Hannah. Vincent?
Very briefly, because I'd like to get more questions in. I think one thing we need to remember is we don't need we don't need to tax people to spend. You know, I think something that's really horrifying to a lot of people on the left is we don't need wealth taxes so that we can fund the NHS. We need wealth taxes to address inequality. There's a number of reasons why we need wealth taxes, but we don't need it so that we can spend. Like, we need to get away from this idea that the government, the central government that creates all this stuff, is somehow beholden to the private sector for money. Like, we don't need their money. We could go out there and spend whatever is necessary, and then we can decide how we want to then remove. A good way to think about it is a bath. You know, if you imagine the economy as a bath, you've got the central government putting money in via the taps. The point of taxation is when you pull the plug out and you drain some of that money away so that the bath doesn't overflow. Now, when you pull that plug, the water going out doesn't come back through the taps. It goes down into the drains. So that's really the way to think about it. So yes, we need to pull the plug, but we can always turn the tap on. You know, they're two separate things. But I think there's an impoverishment of thought here that, oh, we can't do this unless we do that. It's like, no, we can do that. And then we can also come up with a series of measures to make sure that it can be spent in a non-inflationary way. And we could be far more cleverer than taxes or income taxes or petrol taxes. There's a number of things that we could do. But again, it means a completely new mindset. And frankly, you know, hopefully in my lifetime, but we'll see.
Okay, thank you, Vincent. I have two more people with questions, so we'll take those. So it's 20 past, so it's all working out very well. So yeah, Zoe, I have got you, but Tony's had his hand up before you, so I'm taking Tony first.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of points. You asked at the beginning of the meeting about any reference work we've come across in our time. I think I mentioned this before in a meeting. It may have been one of these meetings or not. But the booklet by Diana Coyle, A Brief but Affectionate History of GDP, was found very helpful. I mean, one of the points she makes is that where the public sector uses funds to create activity or whatever kind of output, the GDP is measured on the amount of money that was spent, not the value of the product that came out at the end. So if the NHS doubled its output, its waiting lists, for example, its treatments, within the same budget, it wouldn't have doubled GDP in those terms. It would have stayed still. And I think that's an interesting debate. But the other question I wanted to pose to our colleagues is, what relationship does the organisation either have or want to have with either the Labour Party per se or the component parts of the Labour Party, such as the trade unions and organisations like Socialist Health Association and Education Association and so on? Within that relationship, does it regard itself as a quiet, critical friend behind the scenes, or does it intend to be a publicly irritating, for good reasons, organisation that, together with people maybe like us, is going to keep a Labour government on its toes should that Labour government be elected soon?
Thank you, Tony. Zoe?
Thanks. Yeah, like Tony, I've got two questions really. The first is, people have mentioned like the most recent inflation crisis, and they've mentioned it often in the same breath as having created lots of money because of COVID. But am I right in thinking that the inflation crisis was caused by external factors. It was a limitation in supply, because COVID interrupted supply of goods, they couldn't travel around. And also we couldn't get enough oil because of the Ukraine war and sanctions on Russian oil. So it was really lack of supply that caused that inflation crisis rather than too much money circulating about. So that's question one. Second question is rhetorical. Has everybody seen the films The Big Short and The Bank of Dave on Netflix? Because if not, you need to see them. Okay, thanks. Oh, and Lynn has her hand up as well, Ivan.
No, Lynn's hand's been up throughout the whole meeting, and she's already spoken. So I'm presuming it's an accident, or not an accident. It's a legacy hand. Can I ask an incredibly naive question, I suppose, for the last question? How does the announcements that we've had in the last week about steel in Britain, and specifically in Wales, how does that fit into all this? We've been told that we're going to be the only country in Europe that hasn't got its own facilities for making steel. We have to import everything. And the company is saying that they just can't afford to do anything about it. The government is putting 500 million. I'm completely lost, but this is something from Unite's point of view that is a huge issue at the moment. Have you got any insights on how that fits into all this, if that's possible? I'll take Hannah and then Vincent.
Yeah, another really good group of questions. There's so much to delve into. I'll take them in order again. So yeah, Tony, yeah, GDP is useless. I mean, yeah, I think there's one critique that points out, if you explode a bomb, that's going to help GDP, but look after your mum at home, and that adds nothing to the measure of the national economy. So yeah, completely agree with that. On your question about relationships, I mean, yeah, we're a non-partisan organisation, so we're willing to work with anyone to advance on these issues. And in the past, we have had productive relationships with members of the Labour Party. We used to do quite a lot of events with, oh my God, his name's just completely escaped me. John McDonnell, sorry. And more recently, Richard Bergen's been working with us on this windfall tax campaign. But obviously, it's a broad church for party, and we haven't had too much success on trying to secure meetings with Rachel Reeves' team, but we will continue persisting. And we have also done events with Conservative MPs and peers in the past, more on the green finance side. So Lord Deben, who used to be the head of the International Committee of Climate Change, I think is the acronym of that. In terms of other organisations like trade unions, I mean, yes, I think we definitely want to build more links with trade unions. I think we're quite small, and the big ones of those are quite big. But we have been doing some work with the TUC, because they've also been sort of keeping an eye on these bank profits. So we sort of collaborate with them internally and attend like joint working group meetings with them. So we'd love to build and continue building on all of that. And in terms of Wales, I think the organisation did do some events with Mark Drakeford quite a few years ago now. But I can't think of any other Welsh politicians we've done something with recently, but I can maybe go and see if there's any more of those. But I think overall we sort of go that line of we want to be a critical friend to everyone, really. But yeah, so if there's any other further links or relationships you'd like to build, happy for Zoe to share my email. Zoe, on your questions, definitely this kind of more recent bout of inflation has been very caused by supply side issues. So, and some of the analysis we've done as well is also to point to fossil inflation being linked to that. So because our energy prices are linked to the international markets of fossil fuels, which we can't control the price of, we've seen prices shoot up. Whereas if we had some more homegrown nationalised energy, we wouldn't be so affected by those international market conditions. So that's definitely something that I agree on. And yeah, definitely Bank of Dave. Great film. We have a review of that on our blog, so would second giving that one a watch. And that last question, I'm on steel. Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely shocking what's happened, and yeah, potentially if the government was willing to actually sidle up to things and nationalise the steel industry and then plug loads of money into it, that would be fantastic. And while they're at it, yeah, let's fix the national grid as well, because we also have an issue where even if we had enough ability to create all the electricity we needed, we wouldn't actually be able to get it everywhere it needs to go, because our grid hasn't been invested in for decades either. So yeah, there's a mass list of public works that need doing, but I think, like as Vincent has tried to say, we need to shift the narrative first to be able to actually have those practical conversations, because at the moment we just go around in circles with mainstream politicians and journalists about we can't afford that and we can't afford this. So yeah, it's a tricky one.
Okay, thanks, Hannah. Vincent, anything to add?
Yeah, quickly, on the GDP, I think, the Diane Coyle book is brilliant. I highly recommend it. It's not very big. It's a brilliant explainer on the faults and flaws of GDP. The actual creator of it never meant for it to be used as the way it's being used today. He explicitly said at the time in the 1940s, when he was doing his work for the American government, do not use this as a measure of national well-being. And, what do? We go and use it as a national, measure of national well-being. So it's all out there. He said it decades ago. In terms of relationships, I can't really speak because that's not my job for the 99%. Inflation that's a big issue. I actually raised this in one of the Bank of England committees that I was on when we first started seeing interest rate rises. And I asked, why is it that we are raising interest rates, which will always hurt the poorest? We're removing purchasing power from the poorest people in our society. At the same time, they're having to pay more for goods and services that they had it's not that they have too much money. They never had too much money to begin with. It was totally factors outside of their control. But the Bank of England needs a new mandate. When I was talking about inflation being the key, that's absolutely critical. But we have the tools for money creation. If we have very clear understanding of how inflation is created in the economy, we can create money selectively and monitor the effects and ensure that it's not our money creation that is leading to inflationary impacts. And we can disaggregate that from external factors. The way the Bank of England works, if oil prices go up because of a war and you're having to pay more for your heating, we're going to take more money from you by raising interest rates. It's absolutely insane. I mean, it is an insane way to run any economy, but that is the way that things are done. On Welsh Steel, and actually inflation, I think one thing that we haven't talked about is price gouging. It's no mystery that corporations are having record-breaking profits at the same time. If you look at particularly some of the consumer goods, Heinz, Procter & Gamble, these companies have never made so much money because they're raising prices by 20% when their input prices are going up by 10%. That's very easy to stamp out. During times of war, that was criminal. Maybe we should have some kind of a period where companies aren't allowed to do that. Like during war, price gouging was a crime. Maybe during times where there's disruption and inflationary impacts, we have the same thing here where corporations cannot do this type of thing. You can pass on price rises, but you're not going to be making record-breaking profits. But, maybe that will happen in my lifetime too. In terms of Welsh Steel, I think we need to have a conversation about what do we need to produce here in the UK. If you look at what's happened in the US, they destroyed their manufacturing industry. At vast expense, they're now trying to rebuild it and bring everything back on shore. I guess what will happen is there'll need to be some kind of a steel crisis, wherever it is we're going to get our steel from. In 10 years down the road, there'll be a steel crisis, and then people will go, oh my God, what are we going to do? But obviously that's going to be no help to the thousands of people today. But we really do need to have a conversation about resiliency. And you thought this would have been non-controversial with COVID, with all of the supply disruption that we have, core commodities that the economy needs, like steel. I mean, it seems to me crazy that we're going to be entirely dependent on overseas markets for something as important as that. And that's it, I think.
Okay, thank you, Vincent. Look, it's 28 minutes past. I've got Lynn, who's already spoken once, wants to come back in, and Liam has just put the hand up. You get 1 minute each, but there won't be time for responses, I'm afraid. So you can make your points. 1 minute, Lynn, please.
I just wanted to say that people might wonder why the Labour Party isn't talking about these things. And probably the reason is that a lot of you are probably gobsmacked to understand these things or to have these things presented to you. They seem completely alien. And people like the Shadow Chancellor, she worked for the Bank of England. She must know these things. What is unforgivable is that she's not even prepared to try and explain any of this. And when it comes to taxation, taxation, we've learned tonight you can spend without taxation, but taxation has a fundamental point. And we could actually, if we increase taxation on wealth, we could actually reduce it for the majority of people who vote Labour. And we're not doing this because we're actually, the Labour Party is in hock to the establishment.
Thanks, Lynn. I have to move on to Liam now. 1 minute, Liam. Sorry. Should have put your hand up earlier.
Sorry about that. I've only put it up because it was actually a question, so I don't need to. But this very, very short. If I have, it's just to Vincent really on his point about the Bank of England that he made when he was speaking before. I was wondering, would you support the idea? Would you support actually returning the power to set interest rates to the Chancellor, or would that not be a good policy either? That's be my question.
I think it should be.
Thanks, Liam. I'll let Vincent answer.
We could do it to an independent committee. It would be very straightforward. Inflation is the main target, provided that they understood where the inflation was coming from. Very little would have to change.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for all of the questions and all of the answers. Thank you to both of our speakers for what I think has been an incredibly interesting. I'm not sure that I've really grasped it all, and I'll have to join Sean's special group which talks on these things and why and join him with still not understanding it. But I really am grateful for you coming along tonight and giving us this talk. And I just wish that we'd had more time. I mean, what we could do with is a half-day meeting where we meet in person and we can have a real discussion about these things. But you've done incredibly well, and I thank you for it. Vincent,
Listen, I'd be happy to come back. If you want to organize something, I'd be happy to come back. I think I need at least an hour and a half. It would be a lot clearer. But if you want me to come back, I'll come back.
Vincent, we'll organise something to piggyback with Hay Festival, which is the end of May.
Yes,
sounds lovely.
Sounds like a great idea.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you all very much. Look at this brilliant sharing. It's just 8:30. So thank you all. See you again soon. Cheers.